Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the 5.3 notes presentation on how ecosystems change. This is the last section in our chapter on how ecosystems work, and it's basically talking about how species grow and change within an ecosystem over several years, hundreds of years, decades, over time. So the first process that we'll talk about is called ecological succession, and really all that is a fancy word for is the ecosystem changing. It's a gradual process, so it can take many years or even decades. But what happens is you start with small, low-level plants, and then you increase in size in terms of growing trees, and then eventually, other organisms in a food chain can come in. Once you have a producer base, other types of organisms can come into an area and inhabit that area. So ecological succession is really just changing an ecosystem so that newer species can come in to live there. And it often starts with an area that isn't very well developed and then becomes developed over many years. So if you take a look at an ecosystem over time, it's going from much smaller species to larger species. Primary succession is a type of succession where you haven't had an ecosystem in a place before. So this could be a place that has a lot of rocks or cliffs, sand dunes, places where plants do not grow. Because remember from our first section in this chapter, plants are the base of the food chain. So if you don't have plants, you don't have an ecosystem. You don't have life that can survive in that ecosystem. You've got to have those producers there capturing sunlight and making that fuel available for higher organisms on the food chain. So primary succession, the word primary, if you think of as first, that is first succession. So there's never been an ecosystem before. It's the first time that it's happening. Secondary succession is where there has been an ecosystem before, but it's been wiped out, either partially or totally. And often this happens when there is something like a natural disaster, or even humans will come in and wipe out an area to build something there, gets abandoned, and then the ecological succession can take place after that. So floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, major storms, they can all destroy part of an ecosystem or entire ecosystems. And then it'll have to start over again. You have to start with soil and then plants and build up your food chain from there. A good example of secondary succession that we see in our own community, if you drive up to the Polaris Parkway, there are parking lots where the Germain Amphitheater used to be, or Polaris Amphitheater. It had two names. And that was about, I think it was 2008 or 2007, 2008 is when it closed down. But you can see grasses and things starting to take over that parking lot. And even in some areas, there's like some low-level shrubs, some tiny bushes. So secondary succession is taking place there because no one is maintaining that area that was once a parking lot and an amphitheater. So things start to grow up in it over time. All right, so here is our first pit stop. What is the difference between primary and secondary succession? Make sure you write complete sentences on your notes paper, and you can pause the video at this point to write your answer to this question. So creating a community, and I'm talking about an ecological community, requires that some sort of base to the food chain is established. A pioneer species is one that comes in and colonizes an uninhabited area. So this would be like your stones, your rocks, your sand. And the pioneer species is going to help create soil. Um, the climax community is at the other end of creating an ecological community, and that is the final stable community in equilibrium. So that is a highly developed ecosystem. And that isn't to say that it can't change, it's just that it's very grown and it's going to be harder for smaller species to establish themselves there. So you start with a pioneer species, which makes sense that it would be the first one to come into an area. Think of early pioneers in terms of settlers in American history. And then climax is when you reach the bigger trees and the bigger species, so the higher diversity level of a community, of an ecological community. So as long as the ecosystem is not disturbed, then that community can remain the same over many, many, many years, which is not often the case. Oftentimes, we see a lot of ecological disturbance, at least in the case of establishing new human dwellings, human areas. We tend to disturb communities, but if left alone, climax communities can actually exist for quite a long time. We're actually going to skip the video for that. Wildfires are actually a very important part of the process of ecological succession. And natural fires caused by lightning are actually a necessary part of secondary succession in some communities. And this is not the same as the wildfires that we see going on out west now as a result of climate change. Those are more classified as megafires. They are happening because these natural fires that normally would help with ecological succession were not allowed to happen. And so those the mega fires that are out west are happening because you have a huge accumulation of brush and dead wood that hasn't been cleared out for decades and decades and decades. Normally, fires would burn every few decades and clear out that brush and that dead wood. And so one of the important things that wildfires do in a natural ecosystem is they clear out that brush, and that allows other vegetation to sprout after the fire has cleared the land. So there are some types of trees that only release their seeds when a fire comes through and burns the forest, opening up the seed pods, and then new life can start from there. So wildfires are actually an important part of ecological succession. Unfortunately, the megafires that we see nowadays are destroying a lot of the older trees. So some that normally would not be burned down, they are getting burned up in these huge fires because there's just so much fuel for them to burn. All right, so here we are at our next pit stop. What role does a pioneer species play in an ecosystem? Pause the video and write your answer to this question. And then here is another pit stop. Why are wildfires important? Pause the video while you answer that question. All right, some more terms related to ecological succession. Oldfield succession is a type of secondary succession. So it happens after there's already been an ecosystem. And that's usually when farmland is abandoned. So think of old field, like an old farm field. And when a field is left alone and isn't used for farming anymore, grasses and weeds will grow really quickly. If you've ever gardened before, you'll notice like weeds move in very quickly, even when you are trying to maintain a garden. So over time, though, it'll start with these grasses and weeds, but then taller plants, like larger grasses, shrubs, and then eventually trees take over the area. And that is related to that drawing that you guys are doing this week for your 5.3 outline, showing that it starts with small organisms, smaller plants, and then eventually larger ones come in. And once you have those producers in an ecosystem, then the consumer outlook changes as well in that ecosystem. So here is the picture that's similar to what you guys are going to be drawing in your book. After 1 year of leaving a field by itself, you'll have grasses and weeds. Year 2, you'll get some bigger plants, but still mostly on the ground. In 3 to 10 years, you end up with these shrubs. So this is what we're seeing up at the Polaris Amphitheater area. After 20 years, you can actually see pine trees that grow quickly. And then eventually, at about 150 years, you might have an oak forest. So it can take many decades, but you can have a forest from a field in a relatively short period of time, more than a human lifetime, but definitely doesn't take as long as you'd think to build a forest. So the process of primary succession usually occurs in places where you have new land created, like volcanic islands. Hawaii is a big location for primary succession. And it takes a lot longer because you don't have anything there. You don't have any soil, you don't have any raw material to start with. So primary succession is a lot slower than secondary succession, where you already have materials available to start growing plants. So in the case of primary succession, the first pioneer species that comes in is generally something called lichen. And lichen is It's like a combination, I believe, between a fungus and a bacteria. So that is this green stuff that you often see on rocks, and you'll see it on trees and other things. So these can help break up the rock and make it into soil. So basically, you've got to take this solid material that can't grow any plants on it and turn it into the soil that we think of as the substance that we grow plants out of. So that's primary succession. You start with these lichens and they break down the rock, and that'll form the soil that will eventually host the plants, the producers of the food chain. So here is our next pit stop. How does soil usually form during primary succession? And the sentence starter I gave you is a very telling one about this primary or this pioneer species lichens. Pause the video here while you write your answer to this question. And hey, here's another damn photo to close out our section here on how ecosystems change. Please read through your notes and write down 5 important key points about this section.